All right, well, welcome everyone to the first PSL Demo Day of 2023. I'm your host, Jason DeBacher of PSL Foundation. Today, we're excited to have with us Max Ghenis. He's been a frequent guest on this series, and today he's going to demo with Nikhil Woodruff the new interface for PolicyEngine. Max, good to have you.
Thanks, Jason. Good to see you all. And yeah, so I'm here with my colleague Nikhil, and I will go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, excited to share our new interface for the PolicyEngine web app. So we're the co-founders of PolicyEngine, which is a nonprofit that builds free open source software to compute the impact of public policy. And what I thought we'd do, I would start by just giving an overview of PolicyEngine, our motivation to improve upon the original app, and then turn it over to Nikhil, who will go through some demos really of all the corners of the new interface. So PolicyEngine lets you enter your household information and get your taxes and benefits under current law. It also lets you design a custom policy reform, at which point you can estimate the impact on the US or an individual state, as well as on individual households. And then I'll wrap it up by talking about some of our development plans. Feel free to interrupt with any questions or suggestions along the way. Okay, so our mission is, as I mentioned, to compute the impact of public policy for the world. So we have a free open source app that really tries to make economic policy, tax and benefit policy in particular, more transparent and accessible. And currently our app works in the US and the UK. We're also starting to build in Canada. So we hope to be building something that can be scalable both internally within very complex governance structures like the US and also to other jurisdictions outside the US. And really what we've done is kind of a standard microsimulation approach from the bottom up. So we have survey microdata, and we pair that with data on administrative totals, on taxes and benefits. We tie all of our rules engine pieces to legislation. And we built, we sort of forked essentially the OpenFisca microsimulation platform to build our models. And that was a platform built by the French government. And we sort of enhanced that a few months ago. And in the UK, we've now enhanced all of our microdata using integration with machine learning models, and we've reweighted it using gradient descent. We haven't done all that yet in the US, but I'll talk a bit later about our plans to do that. And we do have these rules engines that we then wrap in the PolicyEngine Python package, also serves API, and we have the web interface as well. So once we have this, it can answer a variety of questions, things ranging from the simple, like calculating the amount of benefits someone is eligible for based on their household characteristics. And we also evaluate somewhat intricate reforms. So you can design as many policy parameters as you want to create your reform. We worked with the UK Green Party to estimate their manifesto, which was a very wide-ranging tax and benefit reform, both adjusting existing policies and introducing new novel policies like a UBI, carbon tax, and land value tax. So all those elements are in the UK model, and many of them are in the US model as well. So here's how it looked when we first launched, which was October of 2021. And we launched this in the US as well in March of last year. So essentially you come into policyengine.org, and the first page you see is all the policies. So policy levers organized by the agency of the government, and all the different parameters, lots of them on a given page. As you're adjusting your parameters, you see your reform being built on the right side. Once you do that, we then run our microsimulation model and estimate the sort of top line 1-year impacts. So budgetary impact, poverty and inequality, as well as other distributional impacts. And these sort of come with a scrollable set of graphs that show interactive data visualizations. From there, you can go to another tab and enter information about your household in fairly rich detail, a few dozen different variables that you can specify. And at that point, you will see the impact of that policy reform on different pieces of your net income. And we also have personalized analytics around how your net income might change depending on your earnings, how your marginal tax rate would change as well. So we certainly enjoyed using this. I think there were a lot of advantages of that design over what had been done in the past by other organizations, but there was still a lot of room for improvement. So it wasn't very mobile friendly. It didn't really scale to all variables and parameters. So we have hundreds of variables and parameters, policy parameters in the model, and we had to basically enter those one by one. So we only showed a subset of them in the interface. Also, limited deep linking, which we found was a pretty popular feature, especially on social media. For example, if you wanted to say, okay, here's this policy I designed. Now here's how it affects this household, or here's a specific chart. We only had the deep linking to policies, not the other pieces. And I think more fundamentally, we were kind of conflating two of our user profiles. So there's the consumer or household profile who might just want to know, under current law, what are the taxes and benefits I'm eligible for? And then compare that to the policy reform, policy expert kind of profile where they're going to think, okay, I want basically a CBO preview in my pocket. And there's an intersection there where you're not just interested in the impact on the US or some state, but also an individual household. But I still think there was this opportunity for clearer separation of these profiles. So those were some of the top motivations. We made a variety of other improvements along the way, but we launched this new app about a week and a half ago, and I will turn it over to Nikhil to show how that looks.
Thanks, Max. Okay, let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see this now. Can everyone see the PolicyEngine.org homepage? Okay,
Looks
great. Yeah, so I'm just going to pretty much just walk through like just one concrete use case. But the first thing I guess to point out is that the homepage looks slightly different than it did before. We've sort of collected all of the different blog post analysis pieces that we write on different policy ideas as they came up, and some more examples. So it's not a completely unfamiliar interface when you sort of jump straight into it. And it is in the US and other jurisdictions as we sort of added those. The Canada model is a bit sort of still in progress, but the UK model works fine enough. So I'm going to basically just walk through from the household side first, and then have a look at what the policy angle looks like. And we'll have an example of a CTC reform on a family in Maryland. So if I jump straight into this household side, we've got this kind of layout, which is basically 3 columns. And the middle column holds basically what you're going to be interested in for the time that you're on the site. And then you've got some navigation options on the left, and some sort of status updates on the right. So the first thing this is telling me to do is to enter my household details, because if we want to calculate the various attributes for my household, I need to type things like my age and income and household structure. So I'll go through this questionnaire, which is a bit more sort of a questionnaire than the site previously was, which was, the old layout was more of a go through and specify all these parameters that describe your household. And this is hopefully a bit more active. So I'll say I'm a single parent of 2 children, and
Nikhil, could you zoom in a bit?
Oh, yeah. How's that? Great. Is that all readable there? Okay, great. So yes, I'm a single parent, 2 children in Maryland. Let's say I have $20,000 of employment income, and let's say I'm 30 years old. So this is a good combination to get some exposure to a lot of the tax and benefits that are particularly interesting. We've got benefits, we've got refundable tax credits, and those are all listed here because this screen is basically just telling you what is your current situation under current law right now. So we've got various sort of top level outputs, your market income plus benefits plus refundable tax credits, subtract taxes is your net income. And that's what we're focused on here. We've also got some other interesting things on the side, like your marginal tax rates. And the other thing here that is pretty new is we can see not just what your current situation is as you've just put it in, But a pretty common axis of variation here is what's the effect of having different levels of earnings. And so what we can do here on this sides chart here from varying your earnings is we can basically just take the simple input that you've taken and vary your employment income from 0 up to $200,000. And then we can see things like how your net income changes. We could also go and see things like how does my SNAP allotment vary by my household input. So we've got a ton of variables here that we've made available from the model that households can see once they've entered in their current situation. So then I think probably the interesting thing to do is ask the question of, like, this is my household under the current situation, but what if I want to see what a reform would do? So that's where we can move on to the policy reform angle, which we might want to start with if we just were interested in policy reforms and at the economy level. But here we've got the policy screen, which is the other half of this sort of two parts. We've got households who are interested in household level things and policy reformers who are interested in economy level things. So over here, we've got basically a lot more parameters than we used to display in the old version of the site. And we've tried to organize these in the same way that they're organized in the actual code in the model. So we've got a folder structure where we're organizing parameters, defining tax and benefit logic by government department, and then by whichever categories made sense. So if we try and find a reform, what would be a good one to experiment with is the CTC fully refundable or not? Because that's a very, very widely discussed reform, and it's also pretty big and pretty consequential as well. So we could go through the folder structure, we could go through IRS, credits, child tax credit. But the other thing that we've added in this version of the site is the ability just to search directly for a parameter using this search bar in the top left. So if we click on that, that takes us directly to the parameter that we would have found by going through the folders. And this is just, okay, this is an on-off switch. Is the CTC fully refundable or not? And I'm going to click that. And then what that's done is that's basically said, okay, here's the history of that parameter over time. You've told it that it should be true from 2022 onwards, and that's what we're showing here. So then on the right-hand side, we've got this sort of status update of, this is the policy that you've made. It's called policy number 14, and it's enabling this parameter. Do you want to simulate it in United States or a particular state over 2023 or a previous year, and against a particular baseline, which we won't go into just now. So if we run through this simulation option, then we get a quick pop-up that basically says, okay, here's what's happened. We're simulating a reform over a few thousand households in the CPS. You can view more details about how we actually got there, if you like. And then once you click the see this results panel, you can basically see, okay, what is the actual year impact of this reform? And so the most important thing probably is the actual cost of the reform. And so we can see, okay, this reform costs 24 billion. Here's why. It's because tax revenues fell by 24 billion and benefit spending didn't change. That might look different for other reforms. And then if we want to know other things about the reform, that's what we've got this menu on the bottom left for. So there are plenty of different outputs that we might care about, and we've sort of split them all out. So each one has a whole page dedicated to it. For example, if we wanted to know, okay, what is the distributional impact by income deciles? We can see this decile chart here. We can look at the average impact. We can see, okay, within each decile, what is the distribution of outcomes that happens? We could go having a look at poverty or deep poverty levels, and as well as income inequality and tax benefit cliffs impacts. So there's a lot of outputs here, and we might go back and play around with the policy and add different provisions to it. But the other thing we might like to do is go back and calculate what is the impact of this policy on the household that we entered in at the start, or any other household. And so if we want
Sorry,
to move
Nikhil,
on,
before you move on, just because
yeah.
it's kind of new, could you show the cliff chart
Oh yeah, sure.
and the Python?
Yes. I can start with the Python one actually while that's going. So our model is entirely written in Python. So we've got a Python package that you can install via pip, and you can reproduce all of these outcomes, all these charts from the Python package. And to make that a bit easier, we've just added a code snippet that you can copy into a notebook and use to create a simulation interface or just a simple data frame with all of the relevant variables that you might care about. So let's see.
And while that's going, I'll also note that if you look at the URL, so we've got this focus equals. So we're seeing the link that goes specifically to a chart. So now you don't have to say, okay, scroll 3 charts down from the top. There's also a household ID in the URL. So before you could only link to a policy, now you can link to a household to really get very specific in terms of sharing on email or social media what the specific source for your claim is per PolicyEngine.
Okay, interesting. So the cliff impact basically tells you in the baseline, the cliff rate is basically the share of households who would effectively have a pay cut if they took a pay rise of about £2,000 or dollars. So this is basically saying that if this policy reform comes into effect, then we'd expect the total percentage of people affected by tax benefit cliffs and also the total amount of money actually in play in these cliffs to rise very slightly, which, I mean, the cliff impacts always tend to be a bit counterintuitive sometimes. But yeah. Okay, so if we wanted to move back onto the household impact, then on the right-hand side, we've got this this sort of non-primary button to go back to this side. And if we click that, then we can see for this household, this policy basically increases their net income by $1,375. So we can see the breakdown, and what's happened here is all of these components which used to add up to the total are now telling us the actual change. So your refundable tax credits rose by this much, your state tax credits didn't change, and your tax didn't change. So that's why your net income rose. And then the other thing here is we can also rerun all of the charts from before on earnings variations if we wanted to see not just how this reform would affect you right now, but how it would affect you as your earnings varied. So if we see the same chart, we've now got an extra line on here, which if we show only the difference, we can basically see, okay, here's where your current change is, and we're pretty far down the slope of possible changes. If we had no earnings, obviously making the child tax credit fully refundable would be quite a big increase because it would be 0 in the baseline without that. And we'd only need to have an extra $8,500 of earnings to basically make this reform completely inactive for this particular household. The other thing here is marginal tax rates. So that earnings chart basically shows you, okay, what are the work incentives at play here? But if we want to drill down on those work incentives specifically, we can look at the marginal tax rate chart. And this one tends to look quite complex most of the time. This is basically showing you at every given earnings level, what percentage of marginal income is lost to either tax rises or benefit withdrawals. So we can see here that this pretty much unambiguously raises marginal tax rates, which makes sense because the phasing of the CTC cuts marginal tax rates compared to the baseline. And so if you basically cut out that that phase in, then you're going to decrease work incentives in that way. And like the other chart, we can only show the difference in order to figure out exactly where the marginal tax rate increases are. So 15% here, 25% here. It's not going to be constant because you've got plenty of other programs that also happen at the same time and make things quite complex. But that's the general direction of the MTR changes. And then so finally, like we had the reproduce in Python section of the economy part, we've also got this for the household. So you can run this simulation and plug in this specific household and also calculate using the Python simulation, the actual household net income value. And you can also see a computation log of basically all of the variables that went into computing the household net income. So I think that's pretty much everything on the site so far. So unless there's any questions anyone has about the demo, I'll pass back to Max.
Sorry, lost my Zoom controls there. Yeah, so thanks, Nikhil. I'll just wrap up by talking about some of our plans in terms of the interface modeling and on the data side. Okay, so we'll continue to enhance the interface. We have a few ideas. I think there's a lot of opportunity in general. So one is full pages on each program. So one thing Nikhil showed is on the net income page, you can really drill in using those plus signs. And that sort of stops at the program level. But you can imagine drilling into SNAP or the child tax credit and then being able to click that and it's a full screen describing that program. Especially for benefits, there's a lot of ambiguity around how you apply for benefits. So we want to help people understand how to do that. Also, a sign-in experience. We didn't show this, but you can actually name a policy today in PolicyEngine. We didn't have that before. But that's, I think, going to be even more powerful if people can save it, to their own profile. So you build a policy, and then you can share that, and it's sort of attributed to you. Same thing with your household information. So you can have that persist and see how different policy reforms will affect you without rebuilding your household every time. Also, automatic social previews. So we have these deep linked charts, all these results. You can imagine sharing that on social, and it just shows you what that chart is. So you have an idea of what you're looking at before you actually go all the way in. There's a lot more policies that we want to model. So we've done federal income tax, a lot of major benefit programs as well. We've done state income taxes, actually in 8 states now. And but TANF, TANF varies by every state as well. We haven't done all of that. And then I think enhancing the microdata is one of the biggest sections we have left to do. So we've done this in the UK, where we integrate different survey data sources with administrative data sources, and then we reweight that using gradient descent. So we're sort of using modern data science techniques to really make a single consolidated data set that can address a lot of different questions. A lot of the time, if you want to answer a tax question, you might go to the public use file, but if you want to answer a benefit question, you might go to the current population survey, and all of these sort of break down at the state level. So we have a plan which we will be implementing early this year to apply that same approach from the UK on the US side. So that's where I will leave it. And yeah, look forward to your questions. Thanks for the opportunity to share.
All right, Max and Nikhil, thank you so much. I've got a few questions, but first let me let any others in the audience ask if you have some questions for Max or Nikhil.
Hey there, this is Kevin Parisi from the Congressional Budget Office. How are you all?
Kevin.
Hey, Kevin.
Nice to see you all. Excellent stuff. It's very cool. I was curious about the usage data that you're collecting, and the sign-in experience was kind of down this path of what I was curious about in terms of thinking about how many users you have using this so far, and whether you've seen some folks increasingly using it, and what kind of data you're collecting, and whether there's any sort of data privacy statements that would be required? Like, I have a hard time imagining many folks just going into this page and entering their actual incomes and household demographic information. There's, a lot of folks that are falling off on wanting to share that kind of topic. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel like I see Nikhil pulling up our Google Analytics, so he might give a better sense. But usage is primarily, I think, among policy wonks so even on the household side, people are using that to understand the impact on specific households rather than themselves. This first round of marketing and videos sort of the new version, we are really targeting to that policy community. We would like to make it even more clear what we are and aren't collecting before we do a bigger push on the household side. So currently, we're not storing any personally identifiable information or email addresses, of course, but we do have this database because we have the household ID that's tying to all the household information that people provide. So we want to make it very clear that if you share that URL, you could be exposing information about your household if you're saying that. But Nikhil, any usage stuff you're finding?
Yeah, I'm just putting out the Google Analytics stuff. So I mean, the 7-day, like the weekly active users is like usually around like 300. It was a bit higher. It was like 500 last week when we actually launched. But I wouldn't, you have a launch, then it goes back down again, unfortunately. But yeah, that's about the rough statistics.
Cool, thank you.
So I had a question about the data work you're doing and kind of synthesizing these different data. So you have many different policy levers, some of which are at the tax unit level, some of which are at the household level, or even individual level. Talk a little bit about how you're dealing with that when you have survey or administrative data that are, again, at those varying levels of aggregation.
You want to take that?
Yeah, sure. No, so I mean, I have the most experience with the UK side. So the structure is pretty much similar to the US side, but of course, like if you have most of the tax data, that's mostly at the personal level in the UK. And so basically our approach to joining those up has been building a model that can predict various like person relevant, like employment income, dividend income, building a model that captures what do high incomes look like at the person level on this type of survey data, and then using that to impute better, more accurate employment income and dividend income values for the existing households in the Family Resources Survey, which is basically the current population survey. So because the things like structures and household properties, you can only really get those from the household surveys like the CPS and the FRS. And so we've basically just been using the other surveys which have like personal level or tax unit level data to impute the actual values that will let us hit the admin targets that we want to hit, but making sure that everything is based off the actual household descriptions in the CPS and the FRS has been the approach.
Okay, that's good to understand. Kind of there's a base, if you will, kind of a base level of data like the CPS that gives you those varying levels of aggregation, and then the others are kind of imputed on top of that. Okay, excellent.
I'll share,
okay. Oh, go ahead.
I'll briefly show what this looks like in the code, because I think this is a really nice thing about OpenFisca that we've ported to PolicyEngine. So essentially every variable is a class of the variable, and we have a formula which takes, so there's an entity level for every variable, and that can be a person, tax unit, SPM unit is basically a concept defined by the Census Bureau that means people who share resources in the same household, or it could be a household as well. And the formula takes that entity as an input, but you can also navigate to other parts of the entity itself. So if you're at the person, you could say, give me some characteristics about the person's household or the person's tax unit, and you can go down as well. So in this case, the SNAP calculation requires understanding, are there any people who are elderly or disabled in the household? And you can do that by basically grabbing all the people, seeing if they're elderly or disabled, and then using this SPM unit.any method to grab that.
Okay.
So that helps us, for example, compared to tax data, the PSL tax data project, that's a flat file. So you have to pre-aggregate everything. We're able to, on the fly, do it as part of the infrastructure.
And I guess a follow-up, how does that kind of interact with the interface you presented today? So for example, with your reform, right, it was this refundable CTC, so you just needed kind of some tax unit level information. But if you had something else or reform, you wanted to change a policy that was at the individual level or something, do you then have to come and prompt the user to enter that household information? Or because they don't have to enter everything up front, is that right? Or
well, they're entering some stuff up front at different entity levels. So they're entering the state is household level. Marital status is also, well, effectively household level. And then they're entering information for each person, their age and their employment income is part of the questionnaire, but there's a lot of other sort of those repeated fields. So that also just works in terms of it's calling our API, which is grabbing some of these repeated data structures and integrating them with the right rules, kind of using the OpenFisca engine. So
yeah, I guess the thing to clarify here is on the household part of the PolicyEngine app, that's kind of a subset of the things that the OpenFisca engine can actually handle. Like if you were to actually interface with the API directly, if you wanted to, you could have like 3 different tax units in a household. It's just that we've kind of simplified that on the actual household calculator so that it's not overly confusing.
And then the microdata is also structured to have the different entity levels. So they'll just sort of works together.
Right, I guess I'm just thinking through the situation where you've entered a number of things at your household level, you've started through your reforms, and then you get to something you want to change, but you haven't entered the relevant information for that. Does that happen? Or
we have defaults for every variable. It's generally 0 or false. Is that, or
yeah, okay, but it's 0 or false,
like
but then if the user, do you prompt the user to say, hey, you're at the default, would you like to enter your specific situation in order to accurately compute your SNAP benefit or whatever it is?
Yeah, so actually I don't think, Nikhil, you showed this, but in addition to that 5-question questionnaire, you can search for any variable and enter it in. This is a new thing in our app. So we have hundreds of variables that could be what's your charitable contributions, which would be a tax unit level 1, or it could be, are you blind? That's a person level 1. So all of those you can do in the app.
Okay, very cool.
Can I just clarify on this again on the same question? My understanding, so I think you have household as your kind of fundamental unit of analysis. And then within households, you have these sub-entities, supplemental poverty measure, food sharing group, and health insurance unit and tax unit and family and things like that. Like every program essentially has a different definition depending on like whether the child lives with you for X number of months or you're paying X number of share of their resources. Is that the right model in my head of how this is structured? And like if you had, is it possible to like have kids split across, or like units spread across multiple households? Those subunits of those entity types across multiple households.
We peanut butter over a bit. So yeah, we have, I think, 5 entities that we actually use. Person, tax unit, marital unit, which is used for SSI, and family, SPM unit, and household, so 6. And we assume, I think that, Nikhil, you might remember this, I think Medicaid and SNAP are both SPM unit level, or maybe
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so that's maybe a slight inaccuracy. We don't have the ability to connect to like link different households. So if you have a child that's in 2 different households, we don't do that yet.
Yeah, I mean the only sort of minor limitation I can think of here is like OpenFisca doesn't let you have like different group formation rules on policy parameters. Like I can imagine it might be interesting to see how like changes to tax filing rules might work out. That's the only thing that might be really tricky with this, but everything else seems to work.
Yeah, it's particularly problematic, I think, with health insurance units where you can, be covering people who are outside of your household, kids that are off at college and things like that.
Does the CBO microsim do that kind of tying kids to multiple units?
I believe our HISIM model does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I'd love to learn more about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
But for Kevin's comment about actually doing that, you'd have to have the data, right? Because it's somewhat mechanical to just tie another individual to a household, but you'd have to have the data of in the population how many instances of this there are. So that you must have great data there.
I would need to check with the HISIM folks for more details on this.
Oh, yeah, I'll definitely have to look at the CPS. I do wonder if something is in there. I don't think it links across households, but at least like how much of the year was a child living with this might be in there.
All right, Max and Nikhil, thank you both so much for coming on today and demoing this new interface. It looks super interesting. I'm going to go on pretty soon. I'm giving a talk to our Economic Society, and I love that you can pull down the Python code and just replicate what you've done. So that might be something I show them this week. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, guys. Take care.